Well, everyone, it's time for us to talk about the first generation iPad mini and see how this device has been holding up in 2023. Now, I probably would recommend people not to buy this iPad anymore. It's approaching 11 years old this year, which is pretty wild. But I will say this was a very interesting choice from Apple at that time. And I'm actually really happy that they ended up making this iPad because a lot of people may not know this, but this iPad kind of paved the way for some major design changes from Apple. So I'll talk about that in a second, but if you want to pick up some iPads I would recommend this year, links will be down in the description. You can get them from there. You can help support the channel at the same time. Now, starting off with the outside of the iPad mini, on the front, we did have a 7.9-inch IPS LCD panel on the front. It was a pretty low resolution panel. It was 768 by 1020 by 1024, and definitely not the highest resolution, but this iPad did come out in 2012. So again, we're approaching 11 years old at this moment, and I do think a lot of people at that time probably will tell you this panel at that moment was actually a pretty big deal. It was also the smallest iPad we ever had at that moment, and I do think that in and of itself was very, very interesting as well. And since then, some could argue that this iPad mini lineup kind of did flesh out the iPhone mini series as well that lasted for 2 generations. So who knows, there's a little bit of overlap there as well with the naming convention. But one other major thing, and probably the biggest thing that happened with this iPad besides the size, is the slimmed down bezels on the sides of the iPad. So if you remember, I think the iPad 2 or 3 were out at this time. Those iPads had a supreme thick bezels. It was crazy how thick the bezels were on that iPad. When you compared the bezels on the iPad mini, even the mini 1, mini 2, mini 3, it pretty much had the same design over and over again, the bezels on the side looked pretty slim, and I liked how the side bezels were slimmer than the top bezels. It gave you the impression that it was of a more modern machine, and that's something I really liked about it. So I will say, if you look at, a lot of iPads nowadays, the iPad 9, the iPad 8, iPad 7, maybe some other iPads I'm missing out on too, they've kept that same slim bezels on the side with the top and bottom bezel being a little bit thicker. I definitely do think it looks and ages a little bit better than, if they were the same thickness all around like the iPad 2 and 3. Now on the bottom, we have our lightning port, we have our headphone jack as well, which is awesome. And on the back, we do have our standard aluminum back, which is perfectly fine. So this iPad came out, I think, around the same time as the iPhone 5. So this was one of the first iPads, I think, as well to have that lightning port. So that was another cool thing. The fact that we had that type of capability, although it wasn't the first device to have a lightning port, I think that may have been the iPhone 5, it's still nice that we had a little bit of a change here, which was pretty cool at the end of the day. Now that aluminum back is still perfectly fine. I think it holds up very well. You have a, single camera setup on the top left as well, which is really cool. And just those things in and of itself, you have to remember, the first iPad came out like 2 years before this thing. So since then, we already have a smaller iPad. We have a little bit of a newer design. We have, I think a better looking body. We also have cameras now on this iPad, and it's faster than its original one, and a new charging port. Those things were pretty big changes at that moment. And although nobody really remembers too much of the first iPad mini, I think it's still pretty cool what Apple was able to do at that time for this specific iPad. So in terms of that kind of covers it up on the outside. Now in the camera department, this is definitely not going to be a good camera anymore, but for what it is, at that time it was a 5 megapixel, camera on the back and a 1.2 megapixel front facing camera. Now you have to remember what iPhone was out during this time. So at this moment, we did actually have the iPhone 5 at this moment, which was cool. I'm glad we had that type of iPhone. Those iPhones have a lot of capability. So the fact that this thing kind of matched that iPad, or vice versa, was actually really cool. And I was very, very happy about that. So with this iPad mini, what you're basically getting is a pretty solid camera for a 2012 device, but it's definitely not going to be that great anymore. Another thing I want to say is that Apple, even though it may have the same megapixel count or whatever, I've noticed that Apple's iPads tend to have watered down sensors compared to their iPhones. Sometimes they may look identical, but I don't know if it's the viewfinder, because the viewfinder is so big, it makes pictures look so much more blurrier. I'm not too sure, but in this specific example, I wouldn't be the first one to recommend getting this type of iPad because of the camera. But again, for the first generation iPad mini to have that type of camera was really cool, and that again in and of itself is a really cool thing that when I look at this type of iPad, it really does get a thumbs up for me from that standpoint. So again, although it wouldn't be the first iPad I would recommend buying anymore, I think it was a pretty big change at that moment, and I'm still, a fan of what Apple did at that time. So it gets a thumbs up for me too, but it's not really a good camera anymore. Now on the software and the longevity portion of this iPad, this is another thing. I mean, it's definitely not worth it anymore in my opinion, but this thing started off with iOS 6. It did go up to iOS 9. So that's another cool thing, the fact that it did last that long. It lasted for quite a bit of time, which is pretty cool, especially for these earlier generation iPads. So what I'll tell you is with the iPad mini, I mean, again, this wouldn't be the first iPad I would recommend buying, but when I look at this iPad, I still think for what it was at that time, for it lasting as long as it did, ending off at iOS 9 was a pretty good thing, considering iOS 10 was a little bit of a weirder update. We look at how the iPhone 5 kind of lasted on, iOS 10, and although that was a little bit more stable, I do think iOS 12, if it just got 2 more versions of software, that would have been perfect. But with the iPad mini, it is what it is. It's no longer getting software support. So because of that, it's a pretty clear answer that I wouldn't recommend buying this thing anymore. And again, that's kind of what's expected. When these iPads get this old, it makes very little sense to buy an iPad like this, especially nowadays. So I would probably just recommend not purchasing an iPad like this anymore, mostly because it's no longer supported with software. So in terms of that kind of covers it up there as well. And the performance side, this iPad had that Apple A5 chip inside of it, and it had 512 megabytes of RAM. So how crazy is that this iPad at that moment had that low amount of RAM and basically the low amount of just power within it. Now it's totally expected, and I'm not hating on this thing too much because that's kind of what we expect at that moment, but it's still a very crazy thing that when you think about it, this iPad was it was supposed to be a powerful machine, and if you look at the power within it, it's actually fairly low compared to nowadays, but it was pretty powerful at that moment. Now, you can't really do much with this iPad anymore, and I remember using this iPad like 5 years ago, and even at that moment, I was like, yeah, this iPad is I can't really do anything with it. I was trying to type documents with this iPad at that moment, and even then it was barely able to do it. It was able to, but it was a very choppy experience. So with this iPad, not only are you severely outdated with software, but now you're also getting an iPad that's very, very just slow in general. So it's not a knock to iPad minis at all, because I love the iPad mini 6, and I think the mini 5 is actually still pretty powerful too, even the mini 4 a little bit. But this iPad, it's clearly not a good performing iPad anymore, so let alone the software updates and the security of this iPad, it's also not that good of a performing iPad anymore either. So that kind of covers it up there. The battery life was also one of the more interesting things about this. It was pretty solid, 4,490 milliamp hours. It was supposed to be smaller. Again, it's a smaller device, so you're not going to be able to get that big of a size battery inside of it. But I was really happy Apple was able to make a good size battery for this thing at that time. So to kind of sum up this whole entire video, what I'll tell you is, I think the iPad mini, the first one, is completely not worth it anymore. But I do think at that moment, it was a pretty solid device. It brought a lot of cool things to the table. It changed a lot of things within the iPad lineup as well. And even the mini moniker actually ended up coming out for the mini iPhones as well. So there was a lot of overlap between these iPads and those iPhones at that time. And although there's a lot more differences now, I can see why a lot of people would look at their iPads and be like, wow, this is just a bigger iPhone. Since then, I think that, stereotype has changed. But for sure, when this iPad, came out, it was pretty powerful. And even now, I still like it. I just wouldn't recommend buying it anymore. So that pretty much covers it up. If you have any other thoughts or questions, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.